Good evening, Calgarians, and welcome to Housing Night in Calgary. So we're about a week and a half away from the April 22nd rezoning vote in Calgary City Council, in which our city will either take steps on the housing crisis in our city or just punt it away to the next city council in 2025, or perhaps never. If you care about the housing crisis, climate change, homelessness, lower taxes, or you'd like us to be eligible for a federal investment of $228 million to create nearly 7,000 new homes in Calgary over the next 4 years, then your city council needs to hear from you, either in the days leading up to the 22nd vote or on the day itself for the public session, and for which there are a number of great Calgary organizations that are able to help you do so. The links for which we will post in the show notes and on the social channels that you're seeing this video. With us tonight are some folks from a few of those great organizations. Catherine Davies is from More Neighbors Calgary. Hazen Elwood is from Strong Towns Calgary. Returning champion Celia Lee is with Sustainable Calgary. And Rob Tremblay is with the Calgary Climate Hub, to which I belong as well. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
So I think what I'll do is I'll just go around the room. I want to get, I want you to just tell us a little bit about your organization and how you come to the housing struggle. Maybe I'll start with Catherine.
Sure. So More Neighbors Calgary is a fairly recently formed organization. We are a grassroots, volunteer-led pro-housing organization. And there's been talk about setting up something like this for a while, but I think last June, when City Council initially rejected its Housing Affordability Task Force before then accepting it the following day, it made it pretty clear that we need a more organized pro-housing voice in the city. So More Neighbors was born very spontaneously, and we've had a great time gathering support for housing and getting to know a lot of pro-housing people in the city.
Excellent. And Hazen, why don't you tell us a little? I should just say that Strong Towns is I think it has international reach. I've been a big fan of Strong Towns for some time, and I was hoping that we'd see a Strong Towns Calgary, and then all of a sudden I'm hearing that there's a Strong Towns Calgary. So I was really glad to hear that your organization was around and active. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Strong Towns Calgary?
Absolutely. So yeah, we're connected to Strong Towns, which people may have heard of as a organization, I think founded in Brainerd, Minnesota. It's a little difficult because our main thing is just openness and inviting everybody to the conversation. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to define ourselves. But I think the main thing on Strong Towners' minds is financial resilience. So especially in Calgary, as a city that has a lot of these conflicting interests that we may think are very political, or even just the math of having a city that does big boom and bust cycles with our resource economy. I think it's been really resonant with people to hear this message of, the way we design our cities needs to be more flexible. It needs to be more feedback seeking. It needs to respond to the needs of the people at the time. And I think right now, in the midst of this housing crisis, Calgary, I don't think we're the fastest growing city in Canada. I think it might be Edmonton, but we're definitely up there. We have pretty ridiculous population increases. And now I think with the most restrictive zoning of any major city in Canada, I think now that Toronto and Vancouver have essentially done what we're proposing here, our city just doesn't have the flexibility that it needs to integrate all the people that want to come here in a way that's ethical for them, in a way that works for our city. And so that's why Strong Towns is a part of this conversation, because we kind of see this as an issue where we can do what's best for our people, best for our government, and best for business at the same time.
Yeah, excellent. And Celia, how about Sustainable Calgary? We've had you and we've had Noel on a number of times before, but tell us a little bit about, how you see your organization fitting into this conversation.
Yeah. So Sustainable Calgary is really rooted in 40 indicators of sustainability that are quite holistic. So they span, health, economy, environment, governance, and so on. a lot of our project work actually has to do with city design and how can we design cities for health. And so when I think of this rezoning discussion, at stake here is, well, how do we build healthy cities? How do we build economically sustainable cities? How do we build environmentally and ecologically sustainable cities? And this speaks to all of those issues.
Mm-hmm. And Rob, thanks for coming on. I know you had to rush to get in here, but tell me a little bit about how you feel like, it might be that some people hear about that the Calgary Climate Hub is really into housing and might want to say to us to stay in our lane. So why is this our lane?
Yeah, no, I think a really good question. And, apologies, I've meant to have more of a arc typed out, but I'm just kind of going straight from my head here. But I think I've actually kind of personally got a bit of like a funny kind of trajectory on how I, ended up being so in support of this. I think, one of the initial things that kind of got me off my butt to be involved with the hub was I saw, a very large focus, I think, on denser urban development when I first got involved with the hub. And in my kind of, engineering brain, I was like, but there's so much else to other things, about climate action that, in addition to that, not instead of that. But and there, I still believe that, there are so many other aspects of climate change as well. But, I think what's really interesting and what's really powerful, especially at the local level about rezoning and, how we're building our city is this is something that is so obviously just a municipal something that's just a municipal jurisdiction to do. Like I think, electricity is something I've focused on a lot with the hub, and I believe that there's a lot of municipal levers to pull on it, but they're relatively exotic levers, if I'm being honest. Versus, with zoning, this is something that is just very, cut and dry. This is something that council is actually meant to do, and this is a lever that they are meant to pull. And I think it is a strong lever, like the way I've been trying to kind of talk about, how this is so related to climate is this is just like energy efficiency, but for our city. We're making it easier for people to live close to places they want to be. We're giving people more options and the kind of size of place they would want to be. Like right now, people are really biased into either living in an apartment, which, due to other reasons that I'm sure we could get into, or apartments aren't necessarily developed in ways that are very family friendly, or, live in a single family home, which is maybe a lot more space than lots of folks necessarily want, but has other perks that they're looking for, like maybe, some kind of yard or 3 bedrooms or something. So I think this is really about giving people more options. And, if they can live in a place that's, this is kind of an awful term, but kind of right sized for the kind of, lifestyle that they want. And if they can live, if there's just more housing that's close to places where people want to be, those are huge for reducing our emissions from buildings and reducing our emissions from transportation by making those shorter trips and enabling modes like cycling, transit, walking, etc.
And I guess, for our viewers, maybe some are less, well, no doubt many are less familiar than we are with, with sprawl and with the vote that's coming up and all of the details. To begin with, the zoning that we have gone with historically is single unit, single dwelling, and really this is all about just opening up the different types of housing that may include more doors and enable more families in there. Maybe, Catherine, do you feel like talking about how this solution fits into the larger housing crisis that everybody hears about, and what this can mean for that?
Sure. Yeah. So Calgary, as you know, is a low density city. We have a lot of single detached homes, and
Sprawl
that's
city.
fine.
Sprawl
City.
city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I live in a single detached home, and it's the house I live in, and it works for me, it works for us. But there's a chart that is floating around. It's this great map of Calgary, and it highlights all of the residential land that is zoned for single detached homes only. And I think it comes in at about 62% of the entire city. So we are highly restricted in what we can build. So I was chatting with my husband actually about this. So we bought the house that we live in about 10 or 12 years ago. And at the time, that was all that was available. I think RCG hadn't even been developed as a land district. So there were really very few options other than houses like the one we live in. And if we had had an option to buy something different at the time. We may very well have. So the square footage of a lot of the townhouses that are being built is about the same as the bungalow that we live in. We've been looking at our heating bills lately and thinking, wow, it would be really nice if we shared walls to, keep some of that down. But just fundamentally, I live in a neighborhood with a lot of single detached homes, and it's a really inefficient use of land. And so we're looking at a land district that is contextual to existing development, but you can almost essentially quadruple the potential density on any given lot. So you can build a lot more homes. And in a growing city, that really matters. I heard something like 62 people arriving in Calgary every day on average, and we are not building nearly enough homes for them. And so rather than restricting the type of homes that can be built, why don't we unleash the potential throughout our city and just, Rob, you used the term right size, like let people choose the type of home that works best for them.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that, it's not, it parallels the climate crisis in many ways. Maybe that's just because my brain is steeped in it, but it's like politicians, political leaders across the spectrum no longer say the crisis doesn't exist. They might not talk enough about, so they don't talk enough about solutions, etc. But we all agree that a housing crisis exists, and yet there's a real struggle in getting these solutions in place at multiple levels of government, let's say. So for me, when I think about the crisis, I'm able to personalize it for myself. And I spoke to City Council about this, earlier last year, just about how when all of a sudden my rent was going up by $500 a month. And, I'm just a lowly climate guy. We don't get the kind of funding that people think we do. And $500 a month matters. And I can see how if that's the same across the city, then there's a lot of people that slip through the cracks. And that's how you create more homeless people. And, so that's sort of that's my personal story about it. Hazen, what kind of stories are you hearing as far as how this crisis is impacting Calgarians?
I think what really, like, zoning reform had always been really big to me, and I think it's always been really big for strong towns, the strong towns movement in general, because we really preach like the traditional form of development in which when a community has more demand, there would be not very many barriers in their way in terms of governmental sort of planning that would prevent property owners, communities from being able to flex and adapt in the ways that they need to deal with that excess demand. And a lot of the sort of culture around home ownership and just having like this asset that grows over time, I think has produced this culture, the systemic culture where we want to keep supply as limited as possible while demand creeps and creeps and creeps. And we've been happy with that status quo for about half a century now, but now we finally let that imbalance fall so far out of proportion that we're seeing housing unaffordability start to become a middle class issue. And I think that's why we've immediately, nobody can deny the crisis anymore because it's on everybody's. I think there's a quote from Paige Saunders in one of his recent videos where he says you can feel poverty nipping at your heels if you're even an upper middle class Canadian these days. And I think it's as a young person, I'm 21, I kind of am very generously housed by my parents. A lot of people who are like me, a lot of people who are, have disabilities, people who have differences in sexual or gender expression, don't have the same privileges that I do to be able to remain at home in my situation, especially in a city where those sorts of people are very are not safe on a daily basis a lot of the time. And I think it's become very, very terrifying and very scary for a lot of the people who are most vulnerable to be in that sort of slip in the cracks mode where it's very, the government hasn't quite taken proactive steps to address the concerns or allow the communities to be able to develop in this organic way. And so now it's become a crisis because we've let it sort of linger for so long.
Yeah, and Celia, I feel like with your work with Sustainable Calgary, you're uniquely suited for this, and it's one of the main other than you're always a great guest, but one of the reasons I really want to make sure you're on the show is because your organization spends time on making cities more livable and more enjoyable by the people that are in it. Does this housing vote enable more of those inclusive, enjoyable cities that Sustainable Calgary has been presenting to us as a city for decades?
Yeah. I think it does in some ways. You know, a lot of the work that we've done on cities has been co-design. And so we work with communities to say like, hey, listen, what do you need in your community? We typically work with folks who do want more walkable, bikeable neighborhoods, but we have a conversation. We say, what do you need? And how can we address that through design? And so we have these conversations that are kind of built in trust and built on information from the community and data. And so we kind of go from there. And so given that, I'd like to say that I empathize with folks who may feel that change is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think change can be hard. But then also call on our neighbors and our communities to then empathize back. And that's what I found in the co-design process is that we actually do develop a lot of empathy during. That's actually, I would say, the biggest outcome of that process is that we just start to understand each other's perspectives a little bit more. So when it comes to decisions like the rezoning decision, I'd love to see more of that. Change is hard, stability is nice, but change is coming whether we like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to decide whether we want change sort of to happen to us and make some of our issues worse, like affordability, like the housing crisis, like the climate crisis, or whether we want to engage and sort of meet that moment and say, well, how can I help? And part of that, I think, is just thinking about the fact that change is hard and allowing yourself to feel that, but then say, but my city needs me. And so they need my empathy. Beyond that, you know, with rezoning, with the idea, if we expect more density, for sure, we know that more dense communities are not just more walkable, they're like directly associated with health benefits like less heart disease. But that's not just density, that's also sort of having nearby amenities. And so this zoning bylaw, I think, will take us part of the way if we want better health and as you were talking about, Rob, a better climate. It takes us part of the way, but we still need to have places to walk to. And we need sort of more concerted efforts to add density, for example, around transit, that kind of thing. Also, if we're looking for more affordable housing, you know, this is a great long-term strategy to reduce the impact on, or reduce a spike in inaffordability in our city. But we also then need to do sort of that targeted work of creating more affordable housing. So those are some of the things I think of when it comes to making life better for our citizens. And just that, yeah, I would like to hear that more in this conversation. You know, this work is about making life better for people, and it's also about being called to help and to say, how can I help? Times are hard. They're not stable. We wish they were, but they're not. What do we do now?
I like it. It brings a little bit of civic pride to the conversation. Hazen.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the co-design thing that Celia touched on. I think it's really insightful to look at the way that look at the process that we currently have in place for doing a land use bylaw amendment, which is currently for I think it's 87 is the percentage of places where you can build residences that can build two or fewer units. I think it's like 63 or so for only one. And so if you wanted to, you know, say you live on like an R2 property in Mount Pleasant, and you know that there's more people who want to live in that community and upzone to RCG, today you'd have to go through, you know, anywhere from a few months to sometimes it could take up to a year or longer just to get the land use bylaw amendment, which you know, goes through the Calgary Planning Commission, and then it goes through administration, of course, at both sides, and then it has to go to a public hearing meeting of council, and then the final decision is made. And so there's just this huge, what I would call a waste of administrative time, especially when 95% of those applications are approved anyway. And cities need everybody. Cities need everybody in order to function. And so a really effective city is one that synthesizes everybody's needs very well. And I think on this debate, we've seen a lot of friction, like a lot of very hard to reconcile friction between, I want my property to increase in value, and I want property to decrease in value, because if I don't, then I won't have somewhere to live. And we see, I want to live somewhere has lots of amenities nearby and is very walkable and accessible by lots of modes of transportation. And, I want more privacy, and I want kind of my own space. And these are, like, of course, very, very valid concerns on both sides. But the problem with addressing these right at the end of the development cycle, like right at the end of a rezoning, even down to the lot by lot scale, with the public hearing, is you have this sense of anger and urgency, and this kind of those people and us over here, that starts to come out. And I've seen a lot of like almost bubbling up to a state of violence in some of these discussions that we're having around rezoning. And I think we can definitely look across the border. This morning, I don't know if anybody saw Ravi Kahlon, the housing minister of British Columbia, proposed kind of flipping the public engagement process on its head. So instead of having the public hearing at the end, we start with the public listening to create a plan that we can work towards. And as Celia said, I think we agree with Strong Towns as well, is that once you kind of bring everybody to the table to talk, well, I need this, okay, well, I need that, it stops being kind of like a fight to just get the bare minimum for your needs, and more like how do we actually reconcile and synthesize the very divergent needs of the people in our city.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Rob, I want to hit you with a bit of a thought exercise here. Let's call it the potential ally onboarding experiment. But let's say that you are talking with somebody and they're not as steeped in, city municipal policy and all of these things. Maybe they've heard a little bit about this vote coming up, and maybe they've heard even some of the fear mongering and whatnot, and they sort of know that that's okay. That's not exact. I know that that's not exactly true, but they want to get an understanding of what's going on. How would you go? What would you say to somebody that you think could possibly be onboarded for engaging on this topic?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of this is really about cutting red tape, and enabling streamlining an ability for our city to do a lot of things, as we've talked about a lot, the housing and climate crisis for sure, but also just you enable economic development as well. I think kind of an interesting thing about this issue, and I think Catherine probably would have more to say on this as well, is that it really cuts across like a lot of different political ideologies. So yeah, I think you'll see, right-wing folks or libertarians that are kind of on, one side or the other of this issue, depending on, their viewpoint. You'll see, very left-wing folks that are on one side or the other of this issue, or frankly, even, environmental and climate folks that are on one side or the other of this issue. I'm here to, passionately say that I think, it is extremely obvious that the climate, the pros and cons of this action are substantially positive for climate action, but there's definitely a lot of ways to see this. So I think, one that does appeal to a lot of people is just, this is just something very reasonable. Is it, if we're looking at, what an RCG development is this something that is so different from the existing single family designs that we have that it warrants, a year-long process to go and rezone the property? And I think almost anyone would say, who's not, primed on the issue would say, yeah, that seems very unreasonable. This is essentially about how many front doors are we going to allow in a building, right? If someone knocked down a house, and wanted to just rebuild the exact same structure, but they, inside they just, divided it into 4 and had 4 front doors, that's illegal. And I think that's pretty weird. So I think, that's probably a good place to start. Is just, I think this is just very normal, very reasonable. Other cities are doing it. This isn't something that, some radical council they might have read about in a certain columnist's, writings might be pursuing. This is just very normal. There's a really good Twitter account that I've been seeing lately, called This Is Fine, where they just post, different pictures of housing styles, and this is pretty normal. This is fine.
Yeah.
This is okay to have on the street.
Nothing scary about that. In fact, often
Yeah.
they're really, really nice looking places to live.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I'd say, other thing for us to keep in mind, and I'd be happy to dig into this more further along in the conversation, is just, I think this is an important step, and I don't want to undermine it. Like this is a big deal. And I think part of the reason it's a big deal is because it's kind of the next meaningful step forward in our process to developing a more livable city. But it's definitely not the whole way. Like as Celia kind of mentioned, there's a lot more that needs to be done on transit-oriented development. I think there's a decent conversation we could be having around, should we be allowing low-rise apartments or certain kinds of apartment buildings anywhere in Calgary? And I think probably the answer is yes. I think there's a lot of housing forms that are, for other reasons aside from zoning, not able to be built in Calgary. Like I was just in Montreal to see the solar eclipse. They've got all these cool buildings where they're almost like apartments, but all the doors are on the outside, and they've got all these outside stairwells. That wouldn't be illegal for certain reasons to build in Calgary now, but should it be? I would say probably, yeah. And it, to quote this Twitter account, I think I'm, in Montreal, and I'm like, this is fine. So I think we could probably get that going here too. So anyways, happy to jump in more about that later, but I'll cede my time now.
Yeah, when we talk about cross-partisan reasons to be into this, I interviewed Councillor Courtney Walcott for the podcast, and I asked him, like, why isn't this a liberty freedom thing? Why aren't the people saying, hey, I want multiple doors. Why can I only build one door? Like, why isn't that a freedom thing? And then it's lower on taxes, so all the low tax people should be, just rather than sprawling your building within the existing footprint, that's a cheaper city to maintain. So it should be something that has cross-partisan appeal. Catherine.
Yeah, so I just want to add a couple of things to what Rob was saying about onboarding people to the idea of making RCG permissible citywide, and also to jump back to something Celia said about empathy. So I have a lot of conversations with people about zoning. It's all I talk about. I think some people in my life are getting sick of hearing about it. But I had, and just to back up a little bit, I've been a community association volunteer for a long time. And so I've dealt with some really controversial development politics within my own neighborhood. And I'm aware that people get very upset when their neighborhood changes. And these are not bad people. These are friends of mine. They are neighbors of mine. And it's just this very strong instinctual reaction that we have. And I think it's okay for people to have those feelings. And I think it's okay for people to say, oh, I'm not sure that I want this. And, but I think sometimes we have to move beyond that. And so I had a really interesting conversation with someone a while ago who's a little bit older. Some might call him a boomer, and he lives in a really nice house in a single detached neighborhood in a south suburb of Calgary. And he said, like, what's going on with this housing strategy? This would have been last summer. And so I told him a little bit about what I thought about it. And he was like, well, I don't want a duplex next to my house. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I guess you don't want a duplex next to your house. But he is also a very thoughtful, caring person. And so he probed a little bit and he was like, well, do you think this will really help the housing crisis? And I, gave him my spiel about zoning. And he was like, okay, I don't want to live next to a duplex, but I will. If that's what it takes, I'll live next to a duplex. And, I think if it's framed the right way, people are actually very amenable to this. And I think most people in Calgary care about their neighbors, and they care about making this a city where we can welcome more people. And there has been a lot of fear mongering. It has been very divisive. And I really hope that as a city, we can move past that and try to have more productive, more empathetic conversations on both sides. And I just want to say for the record, we are a pro-housing organization. It can be it can be very fraught, and it can, we've seen it in the news, Hazen referred to the engagement session yesterday, or anyway, there have been some issues at some of these engagement sessions, and there've been it gets rancorous, and we really try to keep out of the fray on that, and try to keep things positive.
Yeah, I agree, and I think almost anywhere where we're trying to fix some of these crises, there are people getting whipped up, often with disinformation and fear mongering, which obviously isn't helpful. Obviously, doesn't fix a crisis. It's not a very good way to do anything. Hazen.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of touch on just the onboarding as well. So I'm just kind of following up on some things that Catherine said. Is this feeling of like a very staunch protection over the character of a neighborhood. This is super new, and restrictive zoning in general is super new. This is a concept that has barely been around for 100 years. We have absolutely no evidence of a long lasting, gathering of human beings that functions, that has done something like this, or has even thought it important to, spend very limited administrative resources on something like this. And obviously urban planning is incredibly important insofar as, does this type of development mesh well with its surroundings? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the capability to service what's going on here? But at Strong Towns, we always say sort of the traditional form of development is that it would be much more bottom up. It would be a little bit, we say chaotic but smart instead of orderly but dumb. And I think this, what we call suburban experiment, has been very unsuccessful in that we've totally destroyed our city's financial resilience and ability to pay for the services that people expect in a world-class city by spreading out those services over such a ridiculously large footprint. And yeah, I think this sort of like my community was built all at the same time, and it's always looked this way, and it's always going to look this way, is a very unreasonable perspective that I think if people were more in tune with sort of the gravity of and the need to synthesize a lot of these different needs, I think that we wouldn't see so much division on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're dead on there for sure. The next question I want to ask here, I wonder, this might be a bit of a challenge, but I want to imagine the standard sort of elevator pitch thing here, except you're in an elevator and your city councilor is also on that elevator. You have until you get to the 15th floor to convince this councilor that is on the fence on voting the right way on this. What argument do you make? Maybe I put Rob on the spot again. Rob, go for it, buddy. What do you got there?
Yeah, I think I'd just frankly say, this is something, again, that, is reducing red tape that enables us to, start to solve some of these crises. It's going to, reduce property taxes for the average Calgarian. It's going to enable more efficient, less costly, again, to the tax-based forms of transportation for the average Calgarian, enable more affordable kinds of transportation to the average Calgarian. And oh yeah, it's good for the climate too, and your climate plan says that you should be doing it. So you should vote yes.
I like it. Sounds good. Celia, how about you?
I mean, several of my points are similar. Some of the biggest reasons I like this is because it reduces that red tape. It's low stakes from my perspective. So if we look at the amount of change that will be noticeable to the average Calgarian, it's not that much change. 95% of the land use changes that are applied for to BRCG are accepted. So this is just kind of about streamlining the process.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I would add is sort of that leadership component. And so like what it means what it means to lead in terms of, yes, part of that is listening, but part of that is also calling to your constituents for help and asking them to meet the moment. And so that's the piece that I would add.
Mm-hmm. Catherine?
Yeah, if I were in that elevator for a short period of time, I would just try to emphasize that there are legitimate arguments on both sides. But I just really feel like the absolute necessity of this basic need and the fact that so many Calgarians are struggling in a way that is, you know, harming people's lives and livelihoods, I think has to carry more weight. And I would ask my counselor to consider that, to consider the weight of the arguments on both sides, and please to give emphasis to the just the ability that council has to you know, help people who are really suffering here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, that speaks closest to my own perspective. If I were in that elevator, I think the point that I would make is just that, look, this is a crisis. You agree that it's a crisis, and it's the sacred obligation of a leader in your position to alleviate that crisis in a speedy manner. And kicking it down the road to the next council is that's not leadership. That's not crisis leadership. That's something else. Hazen.
I think my pitch would be that as a city councilor, you know, it's in the mission statement of the city of Calgary. Your job is to make the lives of Calgarians better. And you know, if you look at the agenda that's on every CPC meeting, you look at the agenda that's on every public hearing meeting at Council on Housing, and a vast majority of the time is taken up by concerns regarding just these very, what I would call, petty land use changes from, you know, just allowing 2 residences to 4, or, you know, just 4 to 6 or something like this. Like, it's just such a ridiculous waste of time. And I would just say all the concerns we hear are parking, you know, shadows, green space, and that's about it. And to quote one of my friends who said it to Andre Chabot in the middle of a town hall, kind of reiterating this, is, oh man, if only we had some level of government whose job it was to address some of these concerns.
Right.
And I think that's really what people are upset about here. They're not upset about the rezoning. If they were, they would be talking about it. But instead, they're talking about all these other non sequiturs that and what they're really upset about is that the city is not being proactive enough. And I think a lot of that is because they're wasting their time on very petty things.
Yep, that's fair enough. Rob.
Yeah, just because Hazen mentioned it, just want to touch a little bit on trees, because I think, you know, this is an interesting juncture where I think, you know, there's, you know, some kind of in the environmental or climate movement who, you know, have worked really hard on making sure that, you know, Calgary has a good tree canopy, or just even in general, just want to see, you know, literally a greener city, you know, as far as more vegetation in the environment. And I think this kind of juxtaposition where, you know, maybe there is definitely times where, you know, as the city develops and changes, you know, sometimes, you know, trees will have to be taken down and replanted. And I think, you know, there's the appearance, I think, of a bit of a paradox there, where, you know, someone might say, well, how can it be good for the climate if it's bad for the climate because you're cutting down a tree? And I think we really need to keep in mind, you know, on one hand, you know, sometimes people will talk about, you know, the carbon sequestration value of trees. I think we really need to keep in mind kind of the scales and at which kind of that carbon sequestration becomes meaningful. You know, I often say, you know, trees, you know, every tree does literally sequester carbon, but, you know, forests sequester carbon meaningfully. So when we're talking about, you know, forests out in Kananaskis, you know, we're thinking, you know, forests the size of or much larger than the whole city of Calgary. But, you know, an individual's tree, especially one that gets taken care of and probably has in its own way its own kind of carbon footprint in the emissions embodied in, you know, the chainsaw that might be pruning the tree, or, you know, someone just driving to take care of it, they're often not really significant sources of carbon sequestration. So I think that can be kind of confusing, and it's a bit of nuance, but that's, I think, a truth there. And then, you know, the other benefit I think that trees can provide in our city is, you know, shading and kind of making the built-in, you know, kind of our city cooler, which is an important thing. But I think it's also it's kind of a weird thing where, you know, if we're talking about, you know, stopping development and keeping, you know, at least more people out of certain neighborhoods that have a strong tree canopy. It's really kind of about, actually, to me, saving that kind of climate adaptation for the current residents of that neighborhood. And it's not about building, in the long term, a city that's going to have, an adaptable and kind of safe environment for everyone. And, in the long term, we can be replanting trees and we can be doing development that doesn't impact the existing tree canopy much at all, and building a city with a strong tree canopy. But to kind of, simplify it down and ask for something like this to be stopped or slowed down, I think, without being too inflammatory, I think it's really myopic, and I think maybe unintentionally kind of selfish. So I think, we really need to be thinking about how do we get these benefits of trees and carbon sequestration to everyone. And I think, to me, that there's a clear line of which direction's right on this. And I think it's the right direction is, more development that's that's sensitive to kind of to the local context.
Yeah, and of course, if we're talking about trees, then we have to understand that the way we've always built is further and further on the outskirts, gobbling up our wetlands, which humankind has never developed a greater sponge for flooding than nature did with the wetlands. And so that's the other big piece is if we don't find a place to build that makes sense within the footprint, then we're building out there. And that's what this council and all previous councils have the fallback has been the prime way of building forever in this city. Hazen.
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about the counterfactual here, especially with Rob talking about sort of the just like orders of magnitude of difference in climate impact from one property rezoning or an entire block rezoning versus the several blocks it would require on the edge of town to take up that same zoning potential. I think it's really important to, alongside that, recognize that building a new neighborhood at the end of time, at the end of town, is sometimes a trade that needs to be made, but governments eventually have to make back the money that they spend servicing those communities, putting the roads down, putting the pipes down, putting the wires down for those new neighborhoods, building schools, libraries, all these sorts of things that those people frankly deserve to have if they choose to live in a community like that. And so if we are going to build a community at the edge of town, we need to be able to sort of almost do like a carbon offset by developing more in the inner city. And the way that Calgary has traditionally addressed that offset is by, well, I'm going to build one suburban neighborhood here, and then by the time I need to start financing some of those things, I'm going to build 3 more suburban neighborhoods every year, and then use the profits from Peter to pay suburb Paul. And so we actually call it a pyramid scheme, because it's this addictive sort of cycle where you end up if you don't take those very difficult decisions and you make a proactive strategy to be able to densify and create these productive places in established communities, you end up locking yourself into this cycle of car dependence where you keep sprawling and sprawling and sprawling. And that's really the cycle we're trying to break here.
Mm-hmm. Celia.
Yeah, I agree with what Rob and Hazen said. I did want to put it on the radar, though, that having a strategy for urban greenery is very important to human health. And I do believe that's on the radar when it comes to some of these policies. So some of the research we've done has shown sort of the benefits to mental health of greenery, but there's also like really cool evidence about its benefits to physical health. And some of the most recent stuff has been looking at the microbiomes of kids' skin and guts. And so those that are exposed to more of a diversity of plants actually have more diverse microbiomes, which is probably related to better immune systems. And so some of that stuff, I get excited about it. It probably makes sense. We evolved with plants, but then just to I don't know, to hear it back is kind of exciting. And I'd also say that in order to sort of nurture that connection to nature, we need to have some of that within our cities. But I think to folks' point here, we can do that in a smart way, and we can look at the quality of the greenery that we're planting. And if we have more density, the idea should be that it affords us a little bit of space to have some of that connection to nature and have those beautiful river valleys.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And I'll just add on to that, I think I think my personality is usually I have a fairly argumentative personality, so sometimes I think I'm a little maybe too blunt when I say things. But I also don't want to like density that's far beyond what is being contemplated in RCG, and a tree canopy can for sure coexist. Like again, I was just in Montreal, and they have buildings with basically zero setbacks, so no front yard. There's just a sidewalk, and they have I'm looking at a street view image here of a better tree canopy than exists in what I would see in most cities, or sorry, most streets in Calgary. So definitely this stuff can come together, but it will probably just take a new growth cycle for some of these trees to emerge in. But we're not building a city just for next year. We're building a city for 2050 and beyond. So I think that's definitely attainable. And I think if there are folks out there who are very concerned about trees and about preserving habitats, I think I would really also ask that folks consider what's happening in Kananaskis and the level of logging that's happening, that's not directly linked to this issue, just because Calgary is surrounded for the most part by prairies, but there's a lot being logged out there. So, and we have some great folks like Jenny and Colin that are working on trying to have that at least slowed down and made more manageable, but maybe at most protected, and at least a moratorium on some of the logging that's happening over there. So I really can ask folks, if you're stressed out about this issue based on trees, like really consider where you can be saving the most trees for your buck of effort. And I think that's not this issue, it's other issues like the level of deforestation that's happening in Kananaskis.
Yeah, makes sense. I think I think what I want to close off here with is just I know some of some of our organizations have different asks of our fellow Calgarians, and so I'll give you a chance to articulate those asks, or you can just your own personal ask to Calgarians as we head into this important vote. So I'll start with Catherine. What's More Neighbors Calgary got lined up in the coming days between now and the vote that folks can plug in?
So we are working on supporting people to sign up to speak at council and helping people to collect their thoughts and prepare to present to council. And I think it's a really valuable experience. I've talked to a lot of people. So I have a neighbor who got an email from the David Suzuki Foundation, and she's very passionate about the environment. And she said, I want to get involved. And I said, great, let's talk about zoning, because that's all I want to talk about these days. And I suggested to her, oh, you should consider speaking at council. And she just kind of had this look on her face, and I didn't get the sense that that was something that had crossed her mind, but we talked about it a little bit, and I'm like, look, you don't need to be a great orator. You just need to get up there and tell your story and show your support. And I think for a lot of people who've never done it before, it can be quite daunting. I have assured people that actually it's quite fun, and it feels really good.
And empowering, right?
And empowering, yes.
Yeah.
It feels good to share your ideas and your point of view with decision makers. And I've tried to emphasize to people that, they make decisions based on the people that show up to council. And we should all be trying to make our voices heard. So that's our focus for the next little while. We've got a couple of events coming up, including one with Climate Hub on, I think, the 18th. Yeah, so if you are watching this and you don't think of yourself as the type of person who goes to council to speak or calls in to council to speak, think again. It might be the right thing for you.
Yeah, and the part of that whole empowering piece is they work for you. You're the boss. They want you. They want your vote. They desperately want your vote. In fact, there's an argument that the politicians of these worlds only have two jobs. One is to get elected, and one is to get reelected. So they really, really need you to check the box for them. So this is a good chance to make sure they're checking the box for you. That's a good little line. I like that. Rob, maybe you can jump in here with since Catherine was talking about the event on the 18th.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess maybe I can start there. So as Catherine said, one of our main tactics for ensuring that this is passed and implemented is mobilizing folks to speak at the public hearing, which council will hold before finally concluding with the vote on whether to proceed with the rezoning. So we're expecting it to be, for lack of a better word, probably a bit of a thunderdome on, of a public hearing. And I think when things get this big, and then for better or worse, I think it does start to be almost like a little weird mini election where, I think, there's definitely still like, the quality of everybody's remarks is still good. It's great to say articulate and, beautiful things, but at the same time, being there and showing your support is, I'd say, as important, or, maybe frankly, when we have this many people as we are expecting to show the council, maybe even more important. So, as Catherine said, you don't need to be, the best orator in the world, and you don't need to have like the leading expertise on on urban planning. You just need to show up and say, I'm a Calgarian. My values are that I would like to have, a slightly denser, more livable city. And I'm asking you to vote yes on this. And one final thing, just because I wanted to refer back to one of the books that I think has formed a lot of my thinking on climate action. It is Designing Climate Solutions, a policy guide for low carbon energy. So this is where I've gotten, I think, a lot of the ideas that I've tried to work on with the Climate Hub. Definitely would encourage anybody to give it a read. It is a little dated now. I think it came out in like 2018. So, to always make sure you're keeping your knowledge current. But I think I don't want to pretend there's no kind of tension or balance when we're talking about zoning. Definitely, there are pros and cons, but I think when you weigh those pros and cons out, I think it's unequivocal that this is the right move for the climate. So here's just a quote from the book. So it says, zoning and building codes should be designed to enable higher density, transit-oriented, and mixed-use development without causing individual projects to seek waivers for use, height, setbacks, and so on. If no waiver is required, this reduces project risk and accelerates the timeline, thereby reducing developers' financing costs, passing on affordability and emissions reduction opportunities to citizens. So, I think if you're reading a textbook on climate policy, which is what this is, it's telling you, do this. So I think as climate advocates, we should hear the experts saying that and do things like show up to speak at council to tell council to vote accordingly.
Yeah, and just a little additional pitch for both the advocacy training and actually speaking to city council. In addition to the training, we help you sign up. You get onto a WhatsApp stream, and you're communicating with others throughout the process, because it can be a little intimidating going into City Hall, and then you've got their schedule versus your own human being schedule, and being on that WhatsApp line is a way that you end up making buddies. It ends up being a really cool experience, and there'll be other folks from other organizations that are advocating for these same things, and so it's actually a pretty cool time to be a citizen in a group of other citizens that are trying to do the right thing. Hazen, what's either the Strongtown Calgary's ask or just your own personal ask of Calgarians as we head into the vote?
Yeah, I definitely want to expand on that a little bit more. I think it's absolutely fantastic to get engaged in advocacy groups for things that you're passionate about. I think definitely some of the confusion and fear and some of that, what speaks to council, like what it comes from, I guess, this idea that democracy ends when the polls close. But I like to say democracy starts when the polls close. Like that election, that's like a fake democracy. Democracy starts in this realm when individual concerns and community concerns are actually coming together. I think a lot of people are like, oh, parking, then I'll have to deal with something. Good. I think this rezoning conversation, we're saying, here's the struggle we're facing. Here's what we're going to need to do to meet the moment. And then there's a whole can of worms that kind of opens up, and it's like, what about parking? What about shadowing? What about making sure that these people have transit? And these are all really, really fantastic questions. I'm so happy that these are concerns that people are actually bringing up. And to be completely honest, I'm a little bit disappointed that the city hasn't been proactive enough in actually addressing some of these things with strategies that are connecting and making sense to people. Because I think that, as kind of off topic as some of these things are, I do think it's really important that people get engaged and they communicate those concerns in a way that's constructive. It's not an excuse to block housing, but it is definitely something that we're going to have to figure out as our city grows. I would say pivot your concerns, get engaged earlier. Don't have it be kind of this last minute, screaming fest between you and your counselor. and just have more compassion that the people who are standing on the other side of the issue, we get like a lot of allegations thrown around, a lot of like just really weird shutdown sort of behavior where people run out of things to say that make any sense, and so they just have to start throwing things at our character. It's been really beautiful to be more involved in local advocacy, but it's also been really irritating to see sort of the hatred that people let fly for their neighbors. And I think that's something that we should really sort of look into ourselves and cut it out. I don't know. There's no better way to say it. Following up on Rob, if I were to give people a book to read that could sort of help me put some of this stuff in perspective. It doesn't really touch on zoning a whole lot in particular, but I would say definitely read Maximum Canada. I think we're starting to hear what community character really means for a lot of people when their pivot is we need to limit immigration. And it's really important that we remember that to continue running Canada or Calgary as we know it, as this very beautiful, affordable, very high standard of living experiment, we're going to need to invite as many people to come and be a part of this party as possible. And we're seeing a lot of closed door policy, a lot of no more growth. We can't do it anymore. We're seeing a lot of what we call in sort of strong towns, this fragility, this like, no, the problems that we're facing are too much and we can't do it. And so I guess my call is really try to challenge that and say, okay, that's definitely a problem. It's definitely a concern, but how do I pivot that? How do I become more flexible to be able to address that?
Celia, what's your ask of Calgarians heading into this vote?
Yeah, I think I'd start with, first of all, from my perspective, I think that approving the rezoning is the least we can do at this point. Allowing folks to have a secondary suite, allowing townhouses not just in the most expensive neighborhoods, but also in places with lower land values where that townhouse might actually be more affordable. And then we can kind of dig into the work that's targeted and ambitious and maybe a little bit harder. My first ask, I'll give context. Many of the challenges we're talking about, they're not going to go away. And in fact, some of them might get worse for a little while. So whether that's the housing crisis or the climate crisis. And so we're going to have a lot of work to do. And so I'd like folks to just take some time to contemplate that, because I think actually just taking that time to think about it, to say like, listen, things are changing. Our city needs to change. What does that mean for me? And just take that time. And then the other thing I would just say is to reiterate and encourage folks to consider speaking at council. Historically, we've had, there's been an idea of who gets to weigh in on our city. And I've been seeing that change. And I think that's because of the work of the Climate Hub and More Neighbors and the Alliance for the Common Good. I'm seeing that change, and it's really lovely. So spend some time thinking about how you can be, about the fact that we have these challenges. From there, think about how you can be part of the solution. And if you feel so moved, please do speak at council. When I do it, my voice always shakes. I'm always a bit nervous, but screw it. You just do it, and it's not that bad.
Right. And once you do it once, you feel more inclined to go and do it again. And that's one of the best things you can do as a citizen for the city around you is go out there and push for what you think is right. That's pushing for what you think is right is what all of these organizations do that are here today. There's other great organizations that's doing great work in this space and other important work for the city. We're grateful for all of them. Thanks everybody for coming on the show here today, and we will definitely see you on the 22nd.